people in this room. This is very cool and also a bit scary, but anyway. So I'm going to be joined on stage, if you'll welcome up Laura Matthews, co-head of EMEA HR at Bank of America, with Joe Creegan, head of corporate life and pensions at Zurich Life Assurance, and Tim Bergin, who's a partner at EY People Consulting. Right, so we got a really easy subject. Thanks, Rob. ESG. That's not complex at all. So our brief, we're going to be talking to you about ESG and how ESG initiatives influences the talent life cycle. And ChatGPT does not have an answer to this, Rob, unfortunately, because I looked. So researching this topic is so complex, but let's try and deconstruct it. Let's just get right into the center of it. Laura, for you, how much of a role does ESG play in your talent life cycle planning?
Yeah. It's part of everything we do, and obviously we're a huge global organisation, so I think the responsibility for us to really play a huge part in this, given the huge resources we have, and that's not just financial, it's people, it's everything in terms of influence. It's a huge part in what we do. So we obviously we're always, really involved in ESG. Brian Monahan, our CEO, is, himself involved in, sustainable markets initiatives, making sure we're really investing in sustainable environmental growth, but also on a more kind of generic level and making sure that we are involved in everything we do. He's on the Diversity and Inclusion Council, and really in terms of a talent life cycle, it's making sure that we're really sharing what we do. So I think for a long time we were always involved in these things, and we wanted to make sure that we were being responsible with the power that we had. And now we see more and more that people are really asking us questions about it. And that's not just because regulators are interested and they want to see it in our strategic plans, it's because employees want to know about it. And it's a real differentiator, and that might be when we go out on campus, particularly with junior talent. We see from the Gen Z generation, and I'm not a huge fan of Gen Z like this and millennials like that, but we really see that the Gen Z generation, generally spend even less time in roles than the millennials did. So actually, once they join, it's about retaining them too, and they really, really care about being involved. And that's not just at a huge global level. That's about having local things that they can believe in and get involved in. And I think we touched on this when we talked a little bit about it. So if I think about Ireland as an example, it's just some small things that really make a huge difference too. So in every local office, we'll have a charitable partner that we work with for 2 years. In Ireland, that's a loan for the next 2 years, and we spend all of our time raising money for that charity partner for those 2 years. So it's just such a huge spread, but it's very much about the engagement, but it's also about the retaining and the real kind of speaking to that generation with authenticity about what we want to do.
Yeah. There's loads you've touched on there. I should have brought a pen up. Tim, what about you guys in EY? Like, how does this play a role in your planning for talent?
Yeah, I think, I think the answer is that it plays a big part, but I think thinking about the organizations we work with and, even the description Lara's given, I think the kind of really interesting question is why you would focus on that. And I think for all the people sitting in the room, working within HR and working a lot with people, a lot of the obvious answers are, well, it's a differentiator. It's something that can help us to attract people. It's something that, as Laura mentioned, it appeals to people. But if you start getting below that to try and understand why you actually focus on that, you start to get to the heart of it. So does the organization really care about it? Is it embedded in their strategy and how they want to deliver their strategy, or is it just an attraction tool? And I think the reason that's important is that it becomes very apparent when an individual joins an organization, whether or not it was just an attraction tool and something that an organization said because they knew it would appeal to you and they knew it would appeal to your purpose to help you to join, or whether they actually care about it and whether it's evident in the way that they deliver their business strategy. So I think starting with the question of why are we even focusing on it from a talent perspective is important, because you get a lot of the obvious answers. It'll help us to attract people. It appeals to the younger generations, as you mentioned, Gen Z, etc. But is it really important to the organization? Is it fundamental to how you deliver your business strategy, or is it just an attraction tool?
I'm going to come back to the authenticity piece there, because I think that's really, really important. But Joe, just in your world, so you're in pensions, like, I've gone through a journey on this research around ESG, cynical, completely bought in, back to cynical, back out again. But like in the wider world, how much of a role is ESG playing in things like investments and how pensions are being, invested in? Like, is the rubber hitting the road, and is ESG an important factor?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, over the, ESG is very topical now, but actually, if you go back a number of years, we actually signed up to the principles of responsible investment with UN in 2012. So it's not actually anything new. It's been there for a number of years. And what we're now seeing actually is a lot of trustees of pension schemes coming to us and asking us about our ESG strategy in terms of how they invest the contributions that their staff and the employer are making to their pension scheme. So it goes beyond just the D&I when you join the company, and I agree with Tim Laura on that. Basically, people want to know that the organisation embraces D&I and equality and opportunities to progress, but it's now going beyond that in terms of suppliers, your pension scheme provider. What are they doing in terms of the substantial amount of assets that are invested? We manage in Ireland about 32 billion. So what are we doing to actually promote ESG? Yeah. And how we do that actually is by trying to be an active owner. So we hold shares in companies, but we actually actively get involved. We make decisions, try to influence companies. There's a good example of a company called, I have it here somewhere, it's a German coal company that actually has made a commitment to move to solar and wind energy by 2030. So we see that as, a good investment to make because they've made that commitment. So we're actually doing well by the environment, but we're also doing good for our investors, a lot of whom are actually the employees of the companies that we're talking about here. Yeah. So it's moved beyond just the company themselves. What are the suppliers? What is their commitment to ESG as well?
Very good. So is it fair to say, ESG is obviously important as an attraction tool. It's got to be authentic to your organisation's North Star, your sort of why. Otherwise, it kind of falls down as a retention tool. But the key things here are executive buy-in, commitment, again, that authenticity piece. Any comments on that, Tim, or am I on the right lines there?
Yeah, you're getting there, Mike.
Good. Thank God.
We rehearsed this yesterday.
Yeah.
I think one of the things where it becomes very obvious whether it is just an attraction tool or whether it's something more meaningful is how it's actually embedded in business strategy, because that tells you if it's important or if it isn't, and it ultimately starts to play to decision making. And ESG is all about long-term value. So when you look at, for example, executive remuneration, is executive remuneration tied to delivering long-term value in line with your ESG priorities, or is it about short-term value for the organization? And that's really when the rubber starts to hit the road, and you start to see, is it authentic? Because I think ESG as a concept, it is tapping into the social consciousness, particularly on the environmental side and the social side. The governance aspect has been in place much longer, as Joe mentioned. But it is about tapping into the social consciousness, and that's why it's coming through in attraction strategies. It's why it's coming through more clearly when organizations are articulating their purpose, because it is tapping into the social consciousness, so it's helping to attract people to an organization. Yeah. But once you're in the organization, then does the organization put their money where their mouth is? Are ESG initiatives something that's at the side of the desk? They're saying, we'll give you the freedom to do that if you want. Or is it something that's actually backed by the organization? Is it invested in by the organization? Does it show up at the sharp end in remuneration? That starts to tell you, is it about compliance, or is it about something that's more fundamental and core to an organization's values, purpose, and how they deliver?
Very good. Laura, how does that sound to you in terms of Bank America and what you guys are doing?
Yeah.
Is it core, or is it I think somebody described it as like a vanity project,
It's not a vanity project, but it shows itself in lots of different ways, and I completely agree in terms of it has to be meaningful and it has to come from the top, and that cuts across, and there's lots to do, and I think we talked about this as well. ESG encompasses such a huge amount of different things that mean different things to people. And actually, we don't have to be hugely prescriptive, but we do need to make sure that everybody cares in their own way about it. So there's the pieces which I referenced earlier. The regulator will expect us, as a huge bank, to show what we're doing around the risks of climate change or sustainability, what our strategic plan is that takes all of ESG into account. But beyond that, we want to make sure that everybody feels involved and has the ability to do what they want. And we've had, it's goal setting time. It's the beginning kind of the year. We've always cascaded goals around D&I, for example. Everybody has a D&I as a manager goal in their goal setting. Could we stretch that a little bit further around what are some of the other things you get involved in? Because you make a very good point. We have quite a lot of things out there for people who want them as well. Volunteering, spending time on different projects, but we don't necessarily always embed it maybe in quite the way we could, so that it really kind of continues to show that these are the things we embrace and we want you to embrace them. So it's not just about bringing in the people and retaining the people who already have an interest. It's about really threading that through your whole organisation.
Yeah. So one of the things, because I think we're getting into interesting things here around like how you make sure it's got teeth, you make it core to your strategy. But then there's this danger that I was talking to a few people about that, if we start sort of looking at ESG and keeping the E and the S and the G together, and start looking at sort of, legislation around it or the requirement to report and publicise what you're doing, there's a danger that S piece gets lost. Because the E, measurable, G, you're in or you're out, it's a yes or a no. The S piece is so nuanced. Like, where do we think that could go? Or how do we guard against losing, some of the impact that we're looking from that social piece in the middle?
Yeah, I think, you're right that the social piece in all of it is more intangible in ways. And I think ESG by its nature, they're non-financial metrics, so more difficult to measure. Governance, as I say, easier to measure, anti-corruption, anti-bribery, anti-money laundering, all the things you'd expect to see. On the environmental side of things, it's getting clearer how to measure, but there's a long way to go. On the social side of things, it is more difficult. And I think that's where it really starts to become evident how important that is to an organisation. And I think there's been a lot of discussion on hybrid working today and models of work. That's a really interesting one because that speaks to the social side of things. The social side of things is about wellness. It's about the overall experience an individual has within an organisation in part. And if you're facing an organisation who, for example, is mandating 5 days in the office, 4 days in the office, and again, you ask that question, why is that? If the answer is, well, because that's what we think, that's what we want to do, that's what our CEO says, it tells you a lot about the organisation and whether or not they do care about wellness, for example, as a component of the social side of things. So there are a lot of clues that you can look to see whether or not that's important. But there is definitely a lot of work to do in codifying what contributing to the social side of things looks like. Because it is, as Laura mentioned, it's so vast and so broad, and it means so many different things to so many people.
Yep. Laura, your thoughts on the social piece getting lost if we get into that reporting piece or that, we've got to measure everything and then, then bosses want all the numbers to be big or small, depending on which way you're coming at it. But so how do we make sure we don't lose that nuance around social?
Yeah, so I think it's the same. It's about really making sure that we focus on the things that we can focus on. And maybe you can't get the metrics in quite the same way, but you can certainly see the fabric of a company by what they're doing and how they're doing it. So what springs to mind is, and you see this in most big companies now, everyone used to have a 2-1 degree from a really highbrow university to get any job. And now you see so much more that actually people have realized that's not the answer. We want school leavers, we want apprentices, we want people that we can grow, and that helps social mobility, it helps D&I. The focus on wellness, what are the benefits you offer? You can measure that. You can measure, do we offer, meditation apps? Do we offer, a good health care package? There are different ways of really seeing that. Again, remote working, do we have a fully remote working? No, but we certainly allow people to, work hybrid. So it's about there are pieces you can measure and there are pieces you can't. But even where you can't measure it, there are certain ways of seeing the fabric of a company by how they're moving with the times.
Okay. Joe, you talked about how Zurich takes an active role, with the organisations you're investing in. Again, what's your view of okay, what part can you play to make sure that, you know, you're custodians of that social piece and that social impact piece that we know, you know, everybody wants, not just Generation Z. The employees want it, people want it, there's a groundswell. How do we become custodians of that and make sure it doesn't get lost?
Yeah, and that's the important point about, you know, we've got 4 pillars to our responsible investing. Obviously, it's the ESG integration as part of it. You know, you've got exclusions, so we will exclude certain investments. And obviously, we do, using MSCI, we try to monitor you know, reductions in carbon emissions. But that active ownership piece is probably the most important piece, because we don't believe in actually excluding every particular you know, industry. If you decided, for example, not to invest in, you know, in oil or gas, or not to invest in, you know, that's not going to help support those businesses to get to a you know, a sustainable business. And the problem with that is that actually then impacts the social. So the people who would be hardest hit by you know, us not trying to support companies to go in the right direction are probably those people who can least afford it. So, you know, that's why I guess we take this approach towards, you know, being actively involved, is protecting the social as well.
Okay, very good. Okay, Tim, when you were teaching me what this was all about now, so when we were chatting before, you described ESG as the place where all the sort of non-core business metrics are sort of meet, I suppose, or sit in an organisation. So what role can the folks in this room as HR and talent leaders, what can they play in bringing ESG forward into a core business metric? And like, how can we sort of make that more impactful and you know, and give it more teeth?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the answer really is that it's top down and bottom up to create that pressure. And I think if you think about, you know, the role that a lot of people in this room will be playing in the HR space, and the impact that you have on the workforce that you're creating and the workforce that you're bringing into the organization and retaining, the biggest thing I think leaving this room is to ask why at all stages of the talent life cycle. So when you're looking at talent acquisition and you're building in all of the components around ESG into how you articulate the attractiveness of working for an organization, why are we doing that? Is it because we think that it's a tool or a lever to attract people, or is it because it's actually core to our business and how we deliver? When you have people and they've joined the business and you give them the freedom to engage in the things that we might put under the ESG banner, and Laura's mentioned a few of them, is it because we know that that's connected to people's purpose, and if we give them space to do that, they're more likely to stay? Or is it because it's more fundamental to our business and more important than that? And similarly, when you get to the remuneration side of things, which is the sharp end of talent, why or are we not remunerating for long-term value? And that often can be a very important question to answer, because it starts as a HR function to get to the heart of the question. Do we really care about this? Are we contributing to make a meaningful impact in the long term to ESG, or are we paying lip service to it? So I think asking that why question at each stage of the talent journey is a really important role that everybody in this room can play. And I think ultimately that can have an overall shift in the direction of organizations. And, you know, a phrase that's used a lot today and in the conferences like this previously is that seat at the table. That is making use of the seat at the table. It is forcing the question, why are we doing this? And I think that really then leads to having a meaningful change on how the overall business strategy is delivered, because ESG becomes fundamental to it and embedded in it rather than just an aside.
Okay. I think on that point, we're going to leave it. Tim, Joe, Laura, thank you so much for joining me today. Really appreciate it. Thanks very much, folks.